friends. Today we're taking a look at the Luminous Phase Shifter by Alexander Pedals. The more time I spend with phasers, the more I become convinced that they either are or should be viewed in a similar class as overdrive, and in that there are a lot of flavors of it. Not all of them are for everyone, but there is some flavor of it that appeals to everyone. Everybody has an overdrive that they love. Even people who don't love overdrive and prefer distortion or fuzz will find an overdrive that is the particular sound that they would want out of a drive and they can get a significant use for, even if it's an unconventional application. Phasers the same way. Not everybody wants that kind of classic MXR one knob phaser sound, and not everybody wants some sort of crazy ornate 24 stage phaser that is just watery and alien sounding. But somewhere in the pantheon of different iterations and flavors and implementations of phaser, there is something in there that if you use it, it will click with you. It'll change your mix, it'll change the parts you're writing in a way that you love. For me, I have found that some of the essential pieces of a good phaser from my workflow, from my use cases, are the ability to move it very slowly, cool stereo imaging, and often some sort of non-traditional or random LFO controlling my waveform. It's almost like a phaser that you don't even notice unless you took it away. And that's fitting because every single track on that intro piece had phaser on it, drums and bass notwithstanding, but those baritone parts, the Rickenbacker parts, every single track was caked in some amount of phaser, and usually a pretty high mix phaser, just set non-traditionally or set slow, or in some of the cases set with a phaser applied only to the reverb trails, which brings us neatly to the Luminous, the subject of today's video and the newest offering from the Leap series by Alexander Pedals. The Leap series, as you will have seen before, are these small, compact, 2-switch, 4-knob, screen, MIDI-capable stereo devices that Alexander has been developing over the last couple of years that have had really great hit rates, in my opinion. The delay and reverb from this lineup has brought forth some incredibly interesting, both traditional textures and deeply esoteric, bizarre, kind of like off-the-wall sounds. The Rewind has some of the coolest glitchy delay tones I've ever heard, and the Luminous is a great addition to that lineup. Contained within this are 10 unique algorithms and multiple menus to allow you to kind of like fine-tune and tweak down to your exact specific phaser recipe that you want, but in a way that makes it very accessible. I have found that the Leap series stuff is weirdly easy to navigate, considering you are dealing with such a small screen and like basically one kind of like clicky button. It's surprisingly straightforward. And pro tip, by the way, in the submenu, you can control the length you stay on any given screen, which can be incredibly useful. So if you pick one of these up, investigate that right before you do anything else. Trust me. Getting back to the sounds though, this thing has everything from classic phaser tones in the fittingly titled classic mode, all the way out through beautiful, weird, kind of shifting stereo phaser sounds, an infinite mode that I love deeply, and a vintage Japanese unit inspired effect called Unique, which is my standout mode in this thing. It has this kind of like throb control in it that it makes sense if you listen to it. It sounds excellent. It's one of my favorite phaser sounds I've ever heard, and I used it all over that intro for its kind of combination of subtlety and kind of silky, watery movement. It's very non-phaser movement, the kind of thing that you miss it when it's gone, but you're not paying attention to it while it's happening, which is what I love in a modulation pedal. You also have a couple of really cool pseudo phaser implementations in here as well. You have a mode that is a vibrato phaser stacked into a tremolo. You have one that seamlessly blends between phaser and flanger, and you have a digital delay with 800 milliseconds of delay with the phaser applied to the delay trail itself, which again, you heard a ton of on that intro. And that again can be set either subtly for a very kind of simple, easy, effective tool, or something where you can really kind of get distinct, focused dry guitar and then let those kind of delay trails really create color and movement and almost cartoonish kind of bombast if that's what you're looking for in your phaser sounds. It's worth noting, and we're not going to get into it because I can't black out the window behind me, but this thing also glows in the dark, so, you know, is that important? No. Is it fun? Hell yeah. This is cool. So that's probably more talking than we need to do about this stereo in, stereo out, MIDI capable phaser. Let's get to our sound samples, let's run through all those engines, and let's see what the Luminous sounds like. Before we get into our sound samples, as always, let's talk through our signal chain and the context we're working in. I am playing a 1993 Rickenbacker 36012 strung up as a 6-string into the Bondi Squish As compressor, the ZVex 59 sound overdrive, the DCX Boost by Origin Effects, and the Jam Pedals Rattler. From there, we go to the Luminous phase shifter by Alexander, mono in and stereo out, to the Strymon El Cap and the Neunaber Illumine, both in stereo as well. From there, we go to our amp rig, which is the Universal Audio Dream and Ruby in a stereo pair via the GFI duophony. We're running the DCX Boost for a little bit of saturation and kind of tone shaping, and just a splash of reverb with the Illumine. Our bass tone is going to sound like this. Rather than digging through a bunch of like individual presets on the Luminous, what I want to do is basically live on the first one, which I have set up as a very straightforward, basic phaser sound, and then kind of build from there. So we're not going to just like run through presets. Instead, we're going to just kind of start here and explore each engine and kind of build a cool sound on each of the engines as we roll through. Kind of showcase what makes each one unique after taking a look at what is universal across the board. Getting into the settings on here, you can see we've got rate and depth, which are going to pretty much be present across the entirety of this pedal, as well as your mix. There will be little changes here and there, but most of the modes are going to be rate and depth at the start here. This bottom right on this page 1 will always be the engine you're in, and the ability to kind of like run through all those engines, and you can kind of see where those kind of like page 1 things change. Click to go to page 2, and in that classic mode, you have the number of stages, your resonance, the waveform your phaser is following, and the kind of center point of your LFO, allowing you to move kind of the center point across kind of from either end of the waveform towards anything in the middle of kind of like the peak or the valley, depending on how you choose to look at it. From there, you get over to your tap tempo subdivision, the level of the pedal, as well as a filter control, which is used for taming some of the low end that you can get with too much resonant buildup in a phaser, and as well as some ramp controls down there. And we are back to page 1 again. So let's give this classic mode with 4 stages a listen. And then if you dig in, obviously you've got full wet. Which becomes more vibrato-y. Obviously, it's the presence of that dry signal that gives you that kind of out of phase movement. And in this classic mode, the kind of standout thing is the ability to go between 2 and 24 stages in the phaser. So you've got kind of like a really classic, Not a ton of complexity, but a very kind of classic and familiar sound, and the ability to walk your way up. All the way up to 24. Which has, especially as you start digging into some of these sine waves, you can build some really bizarre sounds really quickly with this stuff. And of course, who doesn't love a good random LFO? Set nice and slow, but with a ton of depth. And let's jump to our next mode. Dual phase is a good example of the benefits of a stereo output on this thing. So you've got rate 1 and depth 1 controls right here. Page 2 gives you rate and depth controls for your second phaser. But where things get interesting is you can run them in stereo or in series or in parallel. So right here, phaser number 1 runs into phaser number 2. Or you can have them run in parallel where they're both in mono still, but they're not kind of stepping on each other. They're just kind of running in tandem. And of course, you have options between sine and sine, square and sine, sine and square, or square and square. Which is really cool because, like, let's put them back in series really quick. Let's have the second one be really deep but really slow and have it be a square wave. Let's jump back to that first one. It'd be a lot more shallow but a lot faster, and a sine wave. So now you have give that one a little bit more speed just to kind of help emphasize it. So you can hear that that second one is affecting the frequencies of the first one. But if we set it into parallel, totally different. Or put them out in stereo. And this kind of thing, really cool if you then bring that mix nice and low, just to add some movement. So you've got kind of like dry guitar. So let's jump over to our next engine, which is going to be phase delay. So this is essentially, as the name would imply, a delay line in the phaser that has the phase applied to it and not our dry signal. So you have your delay time and your mix. You get a pretty good amount of time out of it too. About 800 milliseconds, not quite a second, but like for not a delay pedal, not bad. And it's a great sounding kind of digital delay. And then you have your sine, your rate and depth, and that center point control. Let's go back to that hype one. Subtle depth, a little bit more speed on random, and a lower mix actually makes for a really fascinating and cool kind of like random ambient delay. I'm a massive sucker for kind of that like falling waveform. So K-Trem is where things start to get objectively weird in this thing. K-Trem is essentially a vibrato-based phaser with a tremolo built into it. And if that seems weird, it's because it's the kind of thing that's best heard and not described. You basically have intensity of your vibrato, rate of your vibrato, intensity of your tremolo, and a combination of image, sync, waveforms, and stages for varying levels of intensity on this thing. Yeah, it's a fun one. It's deeply weird in a way that I'm really, really in love with, especially when you really start to max out a bunch of those settings. And with down is great. Okay, continuing on our walk through the weirder side of this pedal, let's get to our dynamic. So this is basically going to be an 8-stage phaser where your playing dynamics impact the rate, the depth, or in kind of a classic auto wah fashion, the phaser itself. So rate, depth, and mix. Sensitivity, the rise, how kind of severe the soft side and the loud side are. And then you have the mode. So you can have it off and run it as a standard phaser. You can apply it to the rate, your depth, like I said, or manual mode, which is basically an auto wah. What I love about manual mode, as you kind of like explore your soft and loud balance as well as that rise speed, is you can't really get something slower and subtler than an auto wah that actually ends up being a really cool texture piece. It's almost like a really hollow sounding cocked wah in a very cool way. The kind of thing that I would totally use in like a really ambient context. Let's jump back over to that rate. See, now you can hear it starts to get a lot more severe, I guess is the word. Take that delay back out. Or a much more kind of subtle adjustment between the two. Yeah, super interesting. Or it's just a great, you know, normal 8ch phaser. Okay, jumping over now to Infinite, which basically takes a barber pole style, kind of always rising or always falling modulation, and kind of applies it to the built-in phase shifting as well. So for me, this is a great one because it kind of gives you that never rounds back on itself kind of effect as long as you kind of set it up for that, which is what I really like about it. So let's take kind of like low rate, high depth. Next page, I like hype. I like direction, kind of slightly south of noon with some resonance, and you get something really cool accessible in this particular mode. I think it's my favorite because of how gentle it gets. Or how not gentle if you wanted to do that, but it doesn't sound like a phaser, which is also really engaging and fun. Okay, jumping now over to Flying Pan. Hold for laughter. This is basically going to be your 70s style panning phaser. But this one is really interesting. You can run it in mono and get like a tremolo effect, but in stereo you have your phaser itself, which is going to be your rate, your depth, your mix as expected at this point. But then you also have your panning depth and your panning rate over here. So how quickly it pans back and forth, how far it pans, the LFO for the pan itself, which is really interesting, and then the kind of starting position anywhere in the stereo field, kind of where it pans from and where it pans to. I have found that I actually really like maxing everything out. So if we take those completely out, stick it in the center, give it a sine wave, jump back over to this first page, we have ourselves a pretty standard phaser. A phaser as expected. But when you get into this second page and you start to bring in the panning rate and depth, all of a sudden, you start exploring what I would call a reasonably subtle take on stereo phasing. You're not getting something that feels very whiplashy, and perhaps that can be adjusted by going full wet. Yeah, let's take that pretty much maximum. Let's stay at full wet for just a second here while we and pull up something like that random mode, maximum depth. A little bit of volume up front, just so that we don't lose it in the mix. Like I said, it's a cool, very subtle take on stereo in a way that I think is very refreshing, because I think overly stereo effects can sometimes be something of a crutch in the mixing environment, and something that offers more of the implication of movement than the kind of screamed reality of stereo movement can actually be a much more effective tool for a mix. Okay, jumping over now to pattern. As you can already hear from the noise kind of rolling through my rig right now. You have a number of steps available. You have a rate at which you move through your steps. You have the number of stages available to you, your resonance, which we're going to bring down a little bit, and then the direction down, up, up and down, and one of 8 available kind of preset patterns. So you have a bunch of kind of stepped patterns for this, as well as the ability to kind of choose how many stages of phaser you have, as well as the amount of steps you're actually using from those 8 patterns. So you actually have like a ton of patterns available to you, and they're all MIDI clockable, which is really nice. Go just walking up. Let's jump to a different pattern. Okay, let's get to my favorite of the kind of like straight up phaser sounds in here, in my opinion. That is going to be unique, which is based on an incandescent powered Japanese effect from the 1960s. Now, I don't know what that means, and I don't know what effect it's being kind of referenced there, but it's basically a modification of this vintage effect that has everything from phaser to chorus to vibrato inside of it. So let's just do some exploring. We have our rate and our depth controls as usual. But then you have your staging for normal and double. And this beat control right here, which is basically going to kind of control the amount of, I guess, what would be called throb, which is like, you know, it accentuates the kind of like low point and high point in a different way than the resonance or the actual depth does. And then you have a high and low sync control, which is going to set the polarity of that throb control. So if that kind of beat is going to be a high point or a low point. And again, this is one that I just find to be really kind of compelling in a really interesting and fun way. It's one that I just think sounds wonderful. Subtle, effective, unique is phenomenal. And we're going to close things out by taking a look at the flanger with a PH, because again, we're holding for applause. And flanger is a blending of phaser and flanger into one effect here. So let's dig into it. And let's see what we can get out of that. Page 2, you're going to have your time for your flanger. Right away, you can hear at minimum, we're strongly in phaser territory. Whoops. And then as we dial it up, we get into very, very flangery territory. And if we dial it up, we can actually find some cool blends in between the two. And of course, these are going to be your center point and the resonance of your flanger.